Okay, so today we are looking at Wilfred Owen's war poem called Exposure. We're going to focus on how this poem shows the power of nature. So, firstly, looking at what big ideas Wilfred Owen shares about the war and nature, how he does this, so what kind of techniques, what poetic methods he uses to convey these thoughts, and ultimately why. So, why is he so interested in war and nature? And what is his intention through writing this poem? So I'd like you to pause the video here and just consider what words best describe these images. So based on the images, what big ideas are explored? Perhaps you noticed the cold and snow. The soldiers are exposed to the cold weather. Perhaps you thought about how the hands may have been affected by cold. This is an actual image of frostbite, so the effects of extreme cold on the body. And then in the Titanic, this scene depicts the moment when Rose loses her lover Jack as he freezes to death in the Atlantic Ocean. So this is exposure. But what is exposure? Let's think about this title. A really useful way into any poem is its title, and the root word is the verb to expose. So the word to expose means to reveal, to uncover, bare, just like this man is doing here. He seems to be exposing his true identity underneath a mask. Another form, well, in fact, it's important to mention here. So if we're thinking about Wilfred Owen's intention of titling his poem Exposure, perhaps he's hinting at something that he is going to expose. He's trying to expose a truth of some kind through his poem. Another form is the noun exposure. And here, in this example, the British West Indian soldiers suffered from exposure and frostbite on their journey from Jamaica when they stopped in Canada. So the exposure they experienced is actually a medical term today we call hypothermia. And this is when the body is exposed to extreme cold, causing limbs to drop off, and even like Jack in Titanic, even death. So let's look at Owen and what drove him to write this poem Exposure. He was an English poet, and Exposure is the evocative title he gave to his poems because his work was characterized by his anger, the cruelty and the waste of war, which he experienced during service on the Western Front, so first hand. This is the Western Front, so this is the contested land between Germany and France. This is where the trenches were, and this is where he fought. Unfortunately, he didn't last long, and actually he suffered with shell shock, which we now call PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder, and you will know that from your poem Remains, where the protagonist soldier is suffering with the same fate. This is when the trauma that surrounds a person actually deeply affects their body and their mind, so he was unable to continue fighting. Whilst at hospital, though, he did meet the like-minded poet Siegfried Sassoon. Siegfried also shared a love of poetry, and he also felt the same detest towards war, saying, "I have seen and endured the suffering, and I can no longer be party to prolong these sufferings for ends which I believe to be evil and unjust." Sadly, the evil and the unjust is seen when this young man, Wilfred Owen, was actually killed in action during a British assault on a German-held area on the Western Front shortly after his spell in hospital. So here's the poem. I'd like you to pause and read it in its entirety. It's always a good idea to read it 2 or 3 times. So, what does Owen say about war? Well, as discussed, Owen used his poetry to expose the traumatic, harsh reality of war. And specifically in this poem, he also highlights the power of nature to emphasize the human frailty and vulnerability of the soldiers. He fought during a bitter winter where many soldiers lost lives due to hypothermia, exposure. In fact, some say that even more soldiers were killed by the severe cold than their real opponent. So nature was the more powerful enemy. But how now, thinking of how does Owen discuss this big idea? So what techniques, what methods is he using to make this known to the reader? Well, I think one of the most powerful methods he uses is that recurrent semantic field of cold weather. His references to the ice, the winds, soaking rain, sagging stormy clouds, and snowflakes really conjures up a vivid image of the soldier's bitter, cold environment. And not only this, but Owen gives this weather a vicious, predatory character, as if the weather itself is a cruel villain attacking the soldiers. The violent verbs knive, fasten, fingering, stealth connote how Owen and his comrades felt personally victimised through that personification and attacked by the force of nature. And Owen further characterises nature as a powerful villain through the bombarding sounds around the soldier, the repetition sibilants of S, merciless, iced east, sudden, successive streaks, silence, offers the reader a cinematic landscape of those harsh sounds that surrounded them and really places the reader on that battlefield. We also call that synesthesia. There's visual, there's sound, there's all of these senses happening all at once, quite overwhelming. We can imagine, therefore, how so many, including Owen, the poet himself, became shell-shocked by their experiences. So this human frailty idea, and they've been overexposed, they've been exposed to too much violence, but also weather and cold. But despite the misery and ache of all of this, Owen does somehow provide some comfort in the collective pronoun of our and we, suggesting that all the comrades were at least together, giving some sense of camaraderie. Now, interestingly, camaraderie is a French word meaning the warm feelings felt between comrades, so comrades were the other soldiers there together. However, the overall tone does suggest that despair unfortunately triumphs over hope in this moment as we see rhetorical questions. What are we doing here? Is it that we are dying? Echoing the soldiers' confused and bewildered voices, further reinforced by, and even the love of God. For these religious men, even the love of God seems dying. It's quite dramatic, considering that religious time in which he's writing. So this kind of sense of dwindling faith. And then structurally, this refrain is really important, but nothing happens, repeated. A refrain is a repeated phrase, and Owen has cleverly used this one to reinforce this notion of futility, the waste of war, his anger at the waste of war. They're just waiting around. So he tries to highlight how the soldiers are waiting in the cold, exposed to the harsh conditions, but nothing is actually changing. People continue to die at the hands of cruel Mother Nature, and he really feels that they are wasting away with no outcome and no result. It's pretty bleak, and it's really important that we unpick the poem in that way with the methods he uses, but also we come back again to his purpose and his big why. So remember that one of Owen's big ideas and messages that he wanted to use his poetry for was to actually expose the brutal reality of war. He felt soldiers were needlessly dying due to this unlivable weather conditions. So these images really juxtapose each other in a really interesting way. And back home, Wilfred Owen felt that soldiers' lives were being misrepresented in this propaganda type image. So the expectation was that soldiers were out there triumphantly fighting and non-stop and energized, active, bright, sunny, And in fact, rather than this victory that's being depicted, the reality here is of boredom, of waiting, trudging, beaten down, and suffering. So, in summary, Wilfred Owen's poem focuses on the misery felt by World War One soldiers waiting overnight in those trenches. Although nothing is happening and there is no fighting, there is still danger because they are exposed to the extreme cold, the power of nature defeating these vulnerable humans, and their wait through the night is terrifying. Will they survive? The 8 stanzas are gripping because the speaker describes the trauma of living and struggling in such poor conditions. There is a sense of despair and of lost hope. So, finally, to really engage with your poetry, remember you must consider the poet's purpose. So, why might Owen have written the poem? Hopefully, by now, you have some ideas about what might have inspired him. I think he wrote the poem to criticise the inhumane treatment of soldiers who were exposed to harsh conditions in the trenches. Now, complete each analytical verb with a different idea.